Like Grains of Sand by Simoriel Melnibone. I was born on one of the border worlds, as far from mankind's birth star as is possible to imagine. My home planet housed a single human colony, along with Cretaceous-level indigenous life forms in a band of equatorial rings that blazed like wildfire at sunset. In no place were we quite the same humanity that had flung itself into the stars many thousands of years in the past. In our expansion through the galaxy, we had both gained and lost. On some worlds, the extreme gravity had bred us far stronger than our ancestors. On others, our lungs had nearly doubled in capacity to compensate for the lower oxygen. But on my world, something had happened that made us truly different. The first telepaths were rare, and only able to sense a person's general state of mind, whether they were sad or angry, or if they were lying or telling the truth. But as successive generations were born, the ability condensed and consolidated itself through individuals and bloodlines, until a third of us were fully telepathic, and the rest of us, all the rest of us, were at least moderately so. I was blessed with a full range of telepathic expression, so was able to send and receive words and images, and could hear the thoughts of all the souls in the colony. Every mind was an open book to me, but all children like me were raised to recognize the responsibility that came with such a gift. We were a race without secrets, with no concept of privacy, and I think, because of it, we were greater than the rest of our galactic peers. Working in a kind of harmony only dreamed of on other worlds, we became popular as experts in coordination. Ships visited constantly, recruiting us as specialists to oversee huge projects that would span across dozens of planets. But I had no interest in any of that. I was only interested in one thing, and that one thing was a person. A young woman named Saya. She had been my equal growing up. Another full telepath from whom my thoughts were not private. I can tell you without a hint of hesitation that we loved each other from the moment we met, up until the day I asked her to marry me. This was not the love of shuttered minds. We could feel the depths of our love inside one another, and that wove it into a divine, synergetic helix that we believed surpassed anything ever experienced by two human souls, building on itself and becoming greater with every passing day. The colony could feel our love. It spilled from us like a golden wave, wrapping us all in a joyous tide of wonder and fulfillment, and making us the envy of the outsiders who could not feel it. For the longest time, it seemed our lives were perfect, and even the galactic strife that off-worlders had begun to whisper about seemed irrelevant to us. When we did hear about it, we decided we were too far away. We offered nothing useful for intergalactic war. So we ignored what was happening, and also tried to ignore the increasing number of ships arriving, holes, scorched and blasted, that came to try and recruit us to help in the wars. The day we couldn't ignore any longer, the day they came, was the day I decided to propose to Saya. Of course, she knew I intended to propose. We knew everything about each other, beyond any knowing you can imagine. I also knew she'd say yes, and we both knew we'd be in love until the day we died. We walked to one of the still young beaches of our homeworld. A curve, all stones and boulders, none smaller than my fist. We stood and watched the sunrise, tinting the rings of our world a brilliant red that reflected in the gentle ocean. When I asked, she said yes, and then we stood and shared our thoughts and plans until the first warships jumped into our system and started to descend into our atmosphere. They took all the men, young and old, leaving the women behind to breed new generations of telepaths. We didn't fight because we could read the minds of the invaders, and we knew that they would only kill us if they couldn't capture us. We knew exactly where we were being taken and why. Our telepathy was seen as a massive advantage that could be leveraged over their enemies. And so, as the warship carrying me jumped away from my homeworld, my new life as a soldier began. At first, they used us in negotiations to read the minds of our enemies and steal all their war plans. When the enemy discovered this, ships carrying telepaths were targeted for destruction, and we had to run, our abilities strained to the limit to try and catch a glimpse of the plans in the minds of the pursuing ships. With my prodigious telepathic range, I was able to keep my ship safe, and we dodged through system after system, burning through fuel in relativistic space-time faster than we could replace it. It was a strange war, and a long war, longer than anything humanity had been able to sustain before, as the jump gates were destroyed one by one, leaving ships to use their slower, internal drives that multiplied the time of space travel by a huge magnitude. But wherever we went, whichever direction we traveled, I tried to steer us towards my home, back towards Saya, my love. In the beginning, I tried to keep count of the relativistic time loss, of all the years we skipped ahead of normal space-time trying to reach our destinations. About when I realized that Saya would be approaching 50, I began to lose track of things. We joined up with another fleet and I was put to task organizing supply chains and keeping order. New jump gates had been constructed in the lost years of our journey, and I felt the chance of a homecoming on the horizon, bolstered by the prospect of the enemy's defeat. But of course, life is never as simple as it is in stories. The enemy fleet slammed into us without warning, and shortly afterwards, alarms blared through the ship. I was barely awake when the shock troopers stormed my room and dragged me out in restraints. They shouldn't have bothered. I knew what they wanted, and I didn't intend to run. Within hours, I was delivered to the enemy flagship, where it was explained to me that I was a captured asset, and that I now worked for them instead of my old captors. I think they expected defiance, and were instantly suspicious when I was instead completely compliant. When I explained to them that I could see all of their thoughts, and that they were really no different to my previous masters, they seemed offended. It must be difficult discovering that your sworn enemies are exactly the same as you. Again, I was made to coordinate and supervise, using my talents to pick the best minds for certain jobs, to root out liars and laziness, and to dig into the minds of our enemies for secrets. I suppose I could have sabotaged them, tried to stay loyal to my old masters, but instead I planned and plotted any way to bring me closer to my homeworld, and any way to decisively end the war. How many jumps we made, how many light years we traveled under our own power, I could no longer count. I didn't always know where we were going, as I'd never seen the charts of the places the ship was ordered to find. As the war ground on, automated crews became more common. Android soldiers and pilots could not have their minds read. Eventually, I was no longer needed on the front lines, and my work became more about menial logistical tasks and less about telepathic abilities. 17 days after I turned 38, I learned that the war had come to an end, and that I could go free. The expansions from the wars and the push for territory had jumbled everything. I didn't know what the galactic date had been when I left Saya behind on my homeworld, and 2 new date systems had been implemented since then, confusing matters even more. But I had even more pressing concerns. I needed money to get back to my homeworld, and that meant I needed a job. I scratched out a living as a sort of itinerant counselor, moving until I made it back to the more developed worlds of the Outer Rim. There, I learned just how far from my home I was. Another 10 years of hitching rides on cargo ships and largely autonomous freighters saw me reach the galactic hub, where I sued for compensation for my suffering during the wars. There was no huge payout, but I managed to convince them to pay for my way back to my home planet. With the jump gate system still largely offline from the wars, it was a relativistic race, trying to plot the optimal path back home with the least loss of even more time. By the time I saw my homeworld again, I was 45 years old, 27 years older than when I'd first been abducted. The colony was gone, subsumed into a massive city. There were no true telepaths left. They had all been flung too far apart by the war. And my home had been conquered and reconquered too many times to count. I think I'd known in my heart that Saya had been dead for years, that she couldn't have survived this galactic strife. I'd reached out for her with my mind over the years, trying to warp space-time with the power of my talent so that I could get a message through to her. But I had never succeeded. And as soon as we entered the system that housed my homeworld, I knew that there were no true telepaths left. It was silent, all their voices gone. But coming home had been the goal that drove me, kept me sane throughout the war that had consumed our galaxy for all these years. It was all I'd had to hold on to for so very long, and I wasn't ready to let go. The forested path down to the beach was long gone, eaten by the ancient trees. But I pushed my way through until I stood right where I had declared my love for my beloved Saya, before the war had taken me away. When I looked up, I saw the rings were gone too. The orbiting dust long since burned to nothing in re-entry. The entropy of my homeworld's gravity had slowly pulled their beauty down, And where there had been chunks of rock beneath our feet, now there was only sand. The stone ground down to dust by the passage of 10,000 years. But if I'm still alive, even after all this time, then maybe so is my Seiya. Perhaps she too was caught up in the war and is out there, somewhere, trying to find a way home. And so what else can I do? I'll keep on searching until I can't. Until I, too, am ground to dust.